Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Christiana Best, host and creator of the podcast Inside Out, Outside In. This podcast was developed for and by colleges and universities. It is guided by the themes of diversity, inclusion, and equity. The goal of the podcast is to educate, inform, build community, and inspire change while centering the voices and experiences of people of color. The contents of this podcast do not represent any college or university. Today's podcast episode is entitled Critical Race Theory: What It Is and Isn't, and America's Response to It. So, welcome to Inside Out, Outside In, Dr. Ebony Perez. And
Hi, thank you.
Sure. So critical race theory has become a hot button issue. To a great extent, it is a complicated topic to discuss in many circles, particularly in conservative spaces, as well as in academia. Recently, many Republican legislators in over 20 states have demonized critical race theory and have introduced or passed legislations banning it in educational systems. Similarly, many parents have continuously called for the educational institutions across America to not include critical race theory and not have it taught to their children. Some of them have yard signs up and are calling for the ban of critical race theory by having in their schools. This is juxtaposed by the 2020 racial reckoning we just experienced, of course, which includes the impact of systemic racism on marginalized communities, as evidenced by the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on communities of color, disproportionate impact, I should say, um, on communities of color, in addition to the killing of George Floyd and many others like Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and so many that we cannot even remember their names. So, given those two um, opposing, for lack of a better word, hot button issues, um, we are here today to talk about critical race theory and how it shows up in academia, particularly in the social work curriculum. And I was really blown away by your presentation a few months ago when you presented on the topic, and which is why I reached out to you. So thank you for coming and welcome. And I would like to start by asking you to share some of your credentials, and how you got involved with critical race theory and how you're able to integrate it in the work that you do in academia.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for those kind words. So, again, my name is Dr. Ebony Perez. I am the chair of the undergraduate social work department at St. Leo University. That is my current stead in outside of Tampa, Florida. And so, let's see. I have a PhD. I think especially for folks who are listening to this who are students and they're like, I'm not really sure what I want to do when I grow up. Let me just say, neither was I. And what I thought I wanted to do once I got into college ended up being not anywhere near where I am now. And so I hold an undergraduate degree in psychology. I have a master's degree in social work, and then my PhD is actually in curriculum and instruction in higher education. So I see those three areas of study as being very interrelated, and I use all of it in my own scholarship. I use it in my teaching practices. I think that's one of the beautiful things about social work is that you're not pigeonholed to one kind of discipline or one train of thought. But what I do, and what we all do as social workers, is we look at our situations and our people in context of society and how that overlaps and intersects and impacts our individual and collective life experiences. So that's a little bit about my academic background. Before I jumped into higher education, I was a practitioner for 17 years in social work. My master's degree is from the University of Pittsburgh, go Panthers. And it was there when I really learned kind of that boots on the ground, hard work. And if folks out there know anything about Western Pennsylvania, you know that we are a hardworking group of individuals. And I found that that translated that kind of blue belt, that rust belt kind of mentality, that steel worker mentality, just kind of translated into education, into the classroom, and how you were expected to work and how you were really to go after it. And so that's how I approached my academics. That's how I approached my social work practice. I worked primarily with children and adolescents on the autism spectrum, and worked with people who lived in the more rural parts of Western Pennsylvania to those who were in the cities of all types of socioeconomic status. Because what we know about learning exceptionalities and autism spectrum disorders is that it doesn't care what race, color, creed, money, it doesn't matter. And so that's where I cut my teeth at as far as in social work practice and working with individuals who were on those dynamics. I've also I used to work at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic on the John Merck floor. It's one of the very few dual diagnosed inpatient hospital facilities in the country. And that was absolutely earth-shatteringly pleasant and disheartening
Mm,
simultaneously, um, because you do good work there, but it's so sad that we need it, you know?
mhm, mhm,
And I think that as social workers, we find ourselves in that in a lot of ways and a lot of like a lot of different pathways. And so I've seen and I've worked with people of all races, color, creeds, socioeconomic status, political bents. I've partnered with them all, and I those are some of the experiences that I bring into the classroom. And actually, a lot of the experiences that led critical race theory to make sense to me when I encountered it in my doctoral studies. So, contrary to current belief, CRT is not being taught in any K-12 system right now, and it never was. Um, so that is interesting to me. And as we have watched this kind of socio-political trajectory come about, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that point right there, because then it should make us think, well, then how did it become a hot button topic if that's not where it was anyway? And so you have people moving to ban something that wasn't happening anyway. So it should lead all of us to question and to wonder, so what was the point? What is really trying to be disguised or hidden if that's not what was happening anyway? And this has been a very successful tactic throughout the years. This is not the first time this tactic has been used. Um, and it's not a tactic that's used exclusively by any one political party either, right? So people on all sides of the fence have done this same tactic or utilized these tactics when trying to push forward their agenda. So I think for us as thinking people, we have to wonder, so like what's behind the curtain? What are you really trying to hide, right? It's like Dorothy and her friends, like, wait a minute, what's going on over there? We need to be asking those questions once you realize that this wasn't happening anyway. And so is it really CRT that has us riled up and against one another? Or has it been used in a sense to create division in a place where that wasn't happening. And now you just gave us something else to distract us so that we are not focusing on the meat of the situation. Um, so I guess that's a lot. That's how I came into CRT. That's a bit about my background, my trajectory. That's some of, I mean, and to me, all of that is important, right? Because it very much plays into who I am, how I approach my scholarship, and also how I move and I engage in life, right? So I've been almost exclusively, well, not almost, I've been exclusively educated at PWI's, predominantly white institutions, since seventh grade. So from seventh grade on up, that has been my experience. And I'm very comfortable in PWI spaces, right? I'm very comfortable. If you look at my friends and family, you will see a multitude of ethnicities and shades and races and all of that. So I'm very, very comfortable in talking about race interracially as well as intraracially. And I think critical race theory just made sense when I encountered it as a lens and a theoretical perspective to answer some of the questions that many of us have been grappling with, Black, white, Latinx, Indigenous, about how we encounter racism throughout our lived experience, right? Because race isn't the issue, right? The fact that we are different races, um, which is a social construct, not a biological one. So we need to understand that as well. And that's where CRT started putting some pieces together for me. When I began to learn that our legal system, because critical race theory, critical race scholarship started within the law, right? With the renowned and profound Kimberly Crenshaw.
And Derek Bell, right?
Yes, yes.
Right.
And I always have to give, shots out to Kimberly because, and I say her first name like I'm friends with her. I am not friends with her, but if she ever listens to this and she wants to have a chat, I am all for it because she has so implanted herself in my
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
But her theory on intersectionality, right? And how we are not just one part of our social identities as a woman was life changing. It was one of those like, well, you knew that because you lived it, but somebody gave you the language to express it. And I will always be grateful to her for that. But
absolutely.
understanding how we, not just how we interact with the world, but how the world interacts with us. And that back and forth shapes both of us. It shapes the world and it shapes us and how we see ourselves as individuals and collectively. And that we are not monolithic creatures. As Black women, we don't all have the same experiences, just like all white men don't have the same experiences, that all Asian women don't have the same experiences. So, understanding that CRT really gave me a lens and a language to think critically about how racism is enacted in this country and why race exists in the US context to begin with. Um, yeah.
So, if you were to define it for people, given that we know it's all a mirage when it comes to what has been happening in the country, right? With people
Mhm.
banning it and saying blah blah blah. If you were to define it in layman's terms, right?
Mm.
For someone just starting their understanding, not someone who has discovered it and used it in a theoretical framework for their
Mhm.
PhD, how would you break it down for the average person or someone just understanding it?
Yeah. So, I've had this conversation, off and on over the past several years quite a bit as I be, encountered the theoretical perspective and then tried to understand it and adopt it, for that whole piece of it. But I live in a house where I'm the only academic, right? So I have younger kiddos, and so they're like, "Mom, we don't care about that." My husband is in business. He's like, "I don't," people outside of the academy don't think or
Right.
talk like that. Like, what's wrong with you all? So, as the hoopla was coming up about CRT, and my family had heard me, either talking about it or trying to understand it or reading about it. They're like, okay, what's up with this lady? Like, what's going on here? And what or how I explain it to my family and then to my students who are coming in and saying, we're hearing all this stuff, but we don't really know what it is I ask them, I kind of throw it back on them and make them unpack it, right? So, what is race? And how does racism shape experiences? So, I think ultimately, what critical race theory does is it allows us the opportunity and gives us the freedom to look at our situation, at our institutions, at our country, and say we can do and be better, that this thing called racism that we've been grappling with for 400 plus years, we can do and be better if we're brave enough. And I challenge people to think about that term critical. Right? We live in a world where if somebody is being critical of you, that's a negative. If someone is critical of your work, they're putting you down or you feel like you're being torn down. I like to challenge that and say, if I'm critical of something or someone, it's because I believe in the potential and the possibility for you to do and be better. Because if I didn't care, if I didn't think you could do and be better, I wouldn't take a deep dive look at it. I'd be like, "You're a lost cause." So why am I going to put my effort into that? So I think some of it, right? Like the power of life and death is in the tongue. So we need to think about what it means to be critical differently and to talk about that in a different way. So what CRT does is it allows us and gives us the freedom and the hope that we can grow from this really hurtful, ugly place in our historical context and something beautiful come from that, that
Hmm.
we have opportunity to do that. So that's how I've explained it to my family. It's not shying away from the uncomfortable because it's hard work. It's uncomfortable work. It's dealing with some pain that people in your history have gone through or have caused. Not saying that it's your fault and not saying that you're a victim, right? Because that's the other new spin with CRT is that you're trying to victimize people of color, particularly Black folks. No, I'm I'm nobody's victim. And yet I'm still a descendant of enslaved people. So you can't discount the fact that I'm a descendant of enslaved people and think that that has not impacted my current state, or the fact that I've had for generations who I've had family members who fought in almost every war that this country has had, right? And yet after they fought for this country as soldiers, they came home to a country where they still had to drink and live and exist in segregated spaces, and that the benefits that were afforded to people who fought for this country, namely housing through the GI Bill, education, they were still blocked from that even after they performed and served. And CRT says, well, let's look at why that is. If we take these two soldiers and this one gets the benefits and this one doesn't, let's look at what is the same as well as what is different about them and try to unpack what's going on and why it happened that way. So to me, CRT is about freedom. It is about patriotism. It's about believing in an American society that can truly be united if we are brave enough to face the hurt that we have caused and that we have endured and create something beautiful and different.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. Yet we have this pushback. And we saw the pushback many times, right? We saw it after Reconstruction
Mhm,
with Jim Crow laws. We saw it the civil rights movement, after the
mhm,
civil rights movement. And now we're seeing it again after this really big racial reckoning. Um, so, what do you think have people so scared of CRT? If in fact it is something that it's truth telling, right? If we're saying let's take a look at this, let's take a look at how these two different individuals with the same experiences are treated differently when they return to the country they loved and sacrificed so much for, you know?
mhm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, so I think that's a deep dive answer. Um, so I don't know if you are, familiar with Takaki and his work on American history, like true American history. So I think when we think about one of the things Takaki talks about is the master narrative of American history that our country was settled by Europeans and settled by white folks, right? We've completely written indigenous folks out of that history. The fact that people are just now starting to talk about the fact that there were boarding schools in the United States. And we're like, wait, are you talking about? One of the, again, I said I'm from Pennsylvania. Like one of the first one was
yeah,
in Western Pennsylvania.
yeah.
Um, so I think that part of the issue is that we do not know our history, right? And I think that was intentional because if you tell people the truth about who they were, where they come from, the ills that you have performed, the ills that they have performed, then you have to deal with that, right? So let's stick with our indigenous brothers and sisters, right? Again, I live in Florida. If you've been to Florida, you will notice lots of strange names of places, and people are like, "How do you say that? What is that called?" Right? Those are all indigenous names that, and it's not just Florida. I'm just using
No,
that
it's
as an
everywhere.
example. It's everywhere.
It's here in Connecticut quite a bit.
Yeah, and people have no clue, and so you ride past this street with this or this town with this name that it sounds kind of odd, but this is what it's always been called, and no one ever stops to say, "Well, why? Where is that? That doesn't sound like English. Like, what's going on there?" So I think the fact that we have bought into this simultaneously popular and inaccurate view of the United States being settled, right? Think about Thanksgiving and that tradition, and came around and we all sat down with the Native Americans, and well, there's
we
a
gave
whole
we gave
lot,
them, yeah, we gave them some beads and they gave us the land, and it was an
right?
even
It
exchange
was an
there.
even exchange, or the fact that, in indigenous populations, they don't own the land, they're part of it, right? So I take care of the land, I give back to it, there's this whole different concept of oneness
Ownership.
and being together and what that really looks like, as opposed to what ownership was in Great Britain and how that looked, right?
Right.
And we also need to talk about who initially came from Europe over into the United States. They weren't sending us their best and their brightest. That's not who that they were relieving to come into the country and to explore this new land. In fact, they were sending their derelicts, and they're like, well, if they don't make it, that's cool, because they weren't really part of what we were doing anyway. So the fact that we have this inaccurate view of history, I think that contributes to the fear of it, right? And it contributes to our current socio-political landscape. The fact that people still get very uncomfortable talking about chattel slavery as it existed in the United States. The fact that I have children in the K-12 system, and they learned about the Trail of Tears at home, not in school, right? So all of this ahistorical life that we're trying to live, that what we do doesn't matter to anyone else, that we don't impact our friends and neighbors, that, what happened in the past does not impact us. I think what that does is it helps build boxes and silos of individual and helps create fear. So that when I don't know who you are, I don't know about your people or your customs or your language, and you seem very different from me, then I have a harder time trying to relate to you, to come into community with you, instead of saying, let me get to know you. This is how we make chicken over here. How do you make it over there? What? You don't eat chicken. So what are you eating? Right? Instead of coming at it with that curiosity, I think a lot of it is fear based, and that backlash that we're seeing in this, after the racial awakening. And let's be clear, this didn't start in 2020. Right? That's not when this started. It's kind of like when you put a pot on the stove, a tea kettle on the stove, and it takes some time for things to heat up before that thing goes off and tells you,
Right.
hey, I'm ready. That whistle. 2020 was the whistle.
Right.
But I can distinctly recall the murder of Trayvon Martin
Mhm. Mhm.
and thinking to myself, my dad marched so that we wouldn't have to do this anymore, right? My dad, my uncles, my grandfather, they fought in all of these wars. So we could live in a gated community wherever we wanted to. And then after the verdict, having my son um, turn to me and say, we live in a gated community in Florida. He was elementary age at the time. Does that mean I can't wear my hoodie outside anymore? And fighting back tears and having to try to unpack something that I, as the parent, didn't understand and still don't understand all of these years, after Trayvon's murder. Um, and CRT said, well, let's look at this. Let's look at why this is problematic, and not only why the incident happened, but how a murderer was released, right? And set free. So
Or
I
even not arrested initially. It wasn't until the
exactly.
outcry, right?
Oh, and then when the outcry happened, to say, well, he's not white, he's Spanish, right? So
Right. Right.
we want to twist that.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
folks. So I think some of the is that's my part too, is that it is fear based. It's us not knowing our history, our full history, and only getting bits and pieces. And so then when you learn of the greatness of black and brown people, now it assaults everything that you thought you knew. And so you have to make space for, wait a minute, we might just be equal and on the same level. And just like there are all no perfect people, there are all no horrible people.
Not by race, at least.
Not right.
There may be some individuals.
Right. But no particular,
Right.
race ha-
Exactly.
has the market
Right.
on greatness or
Or
lack
abs-
thereof.
absolutely. I agree with you. I also, it's interesting that you said that your children didn't learn about the Trail of Tears in school, or probably to some extent, many children.
No indigenous history in
Right.
school.
And very little as it relates to African American history, with the exception of saying Black people were slaves.
Well, you have black people were enslaved, right? And
And
and so I'm also very, very particular about my language, right? And
right,
how I teach my
absolutely.
children. And so I always tell my kids, no, we were not born slaves. We
We were
were
enslaved.
enslaved.
Right.
There's a difference, right?
Yeah.
But see that twist right there, if you take the we were enslaved, then that leads you to say, well, by whom
Right.
and for what purpose?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then it starts to unpack some things in a very different way than, oh, you were just born a slave. That's like being, you know,
And it
born with
connects to the 1619 project, right?
their yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Shout out to Dr. Nicole Hannah Jones. Thank you very
Right,
much, sister friend. Um, you know, and I think the other piece that kind of freaks people out about CRT are the same things that freaked people out about Du Bois and Langston Hughes. The audacity of these Black folk shining and being intellectual. Who do you think you are? Right? So I'm challenging all of us out there,
right,
red, brown, black, white, step into your audacity of greatness because people will tell you you can't be. And I think for black people in particular, in the United States context, we have been told that we cannot, should not, were not. Um, worthy of anything, of humanity, right? It's
right,
written into our Constitution, for
right,
God's sake,
right.
which was meant to be a living, breathing document, which is why we have amendments, folks. So again, we don't know our history. So people come up saying, oh, I'm going to support the Constitution. What does it say? What was the intent? Let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Because if that's the point, then we should still have prayer in school. And I'm
Hmm.
not saying we shouldn't, whether we should
Right.
or we shouldn't. However, there was a big push in the 70s and 80s to remove prayer from schools. And now what?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, when you think about the Constitution and the intent and what it is, we don't have a historical context. We really want to live ahistorically, which I think puts us on shaky foundation for living contemporary lives.
Yeah.
And CRT forces us to look at the history and
Yeah.
bring it forward.
Absolutely. And it forces us to look at our current policies and past
Mhm.
policies because those regulate our lives and our experiences, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, I just want to make one comment and then sort of fold it into the curriculum and the social work curriculum. One of the things that you mentioned was the fact that, we have this ahistorical or atypical history. I think those were the terms you used. But the issue here is that it really lifts up one group and it also pulls down a lot. Like, so when I think in terms of this, what is the term used? Sense of inferiority but versus superiority. So if I'm taught that everyone in history has been great that looks like me, I there is nothing that I can't believe in terms of my potential, right?
Yes.
And if you're given the story that everything about you and your people have been awful or terrible, whether, then it builds up this sense of inferiority, right? That you
Mhm.
have to overcome in order to succeed. And
Right.
in order to do that, your parents would have had to have an understanding of who they are historically, and they're not getting it in the school system,
Mhm.
so that they can counteract some of those negative messages they've been getting,
Absolutely.
which is it's so much for us to talk about. So um,
That's a whole
we
nother podcast by itself.
absolutely, absolutely. So we know they're not getting it from K to 12. And here they come into college during the bachelor level program, specifically social work. Social work, one of the values and ethical principles of social work is social justice.
Mhm.
And while it has been, we haven't truly been walking the talk,
No,
you
we have
know?
not. No, we have not.
So we have it, it looks good, it sounds good, but we haven't been walking the talk. And I think when we start talking about CRT in the social work curriculum, we are beginning to sort of walk the talk.
Mhm.
And so I want to ask you, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so let me say I agree with you 100% that social work has been woefully slow, right? As the quote unquote self proclaimed social justice profession, we got some work to do. What I will also say is that there are some social justice warriors out there who are doing amazing work in the realm of social work and social work education. Um, during my doctoral studies, which wasn't that long ago. um, I really had to lean on the field of education because you had Laslings, Billings, and Tate who were doing amazing work with culturally responsive teaching, um, you know, and really look at them and that whole field as well as Black feminist thought and studies, right? So looking at Collins, looking at Hooks, going back and I was a Toni Morrison fan growing up, but I'm talking like her fiction, right?
Right. Mhm,
And
mhm.
then I got older and realized, wait a minute, she's a scholar and an academic too, right?
Absolutely.
And reading Nikki Giovanni's poetry, with a different lens and understanding her history and where she came from, I was like, wait a minute, these women were warriors in a whole different right. And learning that Alice Walker was a scholar, it was like, whoa. So for me, some of that coming into curriculum, and when I think about, I'm in a bachelor's level program, so I'm getting folks in their pre-social work years and then that junior senior year. um, I think about how many things they've been exposed to that were just inaccurate, and I can't fault them for that, right? That's not their fault.
Right.
It's like if you've never been exposed to seafood, how do you know whether or not you like it?
Right.
Like somebody has to
Exactly.
offer it to you, right? And different things taste differently. And so I think that for me as an educator helps me realizing that different people come into your classroom at different levels and at different maturity to being ready to jump into this work. Some people, if I take you to a pool, you're going to have some kids who just they're at the deep end. You're like, "Wait, wait, wait, can you swim?" And they're just ready to go. And then you have other kids who are like putting their toe in and some who are like way over there on the side like, "No, I'm not getting in that water." Right? So the classroom is the same thing. They're coming in at different levels. They're thinking about things differently. They have all of these, kids aren't born afraid of the water. That's why we have babies who can swim. And we've all seen those videos on social media of these little tiny babies and they're in there swimming. And you're like, how are they not afraid of the water? Because their parents didn't make the water fearful.
Mhm,
Okay. Same thing with race,
mhm.
right? If you don't make me fearful, even if I'm different, your kid doesn't innately fear me. They play on the playground like everybody else. They reach out, they hold hands, they hug, you know, like everyone else. So it's the messages that we give them that start to fill that up. And I realize that it comes in relationship. And I'm very real. Like what you get on the podcast is what you get at my dinner table. Like, it just who I am in the classroom, it's who I am in the sanctuary. Like this is just me.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
which not everybody likes, and I understand that. Not everybody's cup of tea, but I'm okay with that too, right? So that's part of being authentic. I'm okay
Mhm,
with that.
mhm,
And I can still learn from you and you can still learn from me. So let's see how we pull these together. So really how I bring this into the classroom is I start from that historical lens. Tell me what you know about Tulsa,
mm, mhm,
right? What do you know about
mhm,
what happened in Tulsa? Tell me
mhm.
know what you know about the Red Summer. And I think one thing that does is it puts folks on an even playing field, right? Because we can talk about some contemporary issues, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We can talk about those and it will invoke very strong emotion, right? All the way around. That can be, if I am a white person and I haven't engaged in these conversations around my dinner table or with my friends or in my community, mostly everybody looks like me, and you're having these super strong feelings, which you're entitled to, that makes me more likely to keep standing over here and not jumping into the water because I don't want to add to that. Right. And it could be, I don't want to add to your pain.
Right,
It doesn't have to be a negative.
right.
And
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, I don't know how to unpack it, and I think that we also have to recognize that for those of us, whether no matter what our race is, who are advocates of racial justice, we have to recognize that that pain is palpable sometimes, and folks want to come play with us, but they don't know how to do that, right? So if I start talking about contemporary racial injustices, that automatically, I feel like, puts us on an uneven playing field. If I take you back historically, let me tell you, 9 times out of 10, nobody in my classroom knows what happened in Tulsa. Nobody in my classroom can tell me why the Harlem Renaissance was as much a political movement as it was a social movement. Nobody can tell me why folks didn't get their benefits after they came home from Vietnam and World War II. So it kind of evens that playing field. And for me, I think that has been really successful because it invites folks all to come in at a similar level where you may be more ready to talk about racial harmony and racial injustice. Um, but when you couch it back further and kind of bring folks forward, then you create a community that can do that together. So CRT allows me the opportunity to say how we have structured society along the lines of race is not new. It has historical roots. It's not anyone's fault, quote unquote. And what we're talking about is we're not talking about individual racist people, because I think that's the other fear that white people often have is you're going to think of me or call me a racist. That's why you have the parents with the signs in the yard that says, don't teach my kid CRT, because they don't want their child to be called a racist. Well, I don't want my child to be called a racial epithet. So we're on the same page, right? We're on the same page. And because we're on
We have
that same,
common ground.
we have common ground. And because we're on that same page and because we have that common ground, let's take a look at what would make you feel like I was calling your child a racist and what would make me fearful that my child would be called a racial epithet, right?
Hmm.
CRT allows us to unpack that. So it's not talking about your individual child or your individual family or even your individual community. It's talking about the institutions and the systems that we are all impacted by that helps build these trains of thoughts. And so I think people are so upset or fearful of CRT because they don't understand it. And like most things we don't understand, particularly in the age of what I call microwavable media, then we lash out. We take our soundbite and we hold on to that soundbite as gospel and we lash out.
Right.
And if we take a step back to say, well, let me really understand this and figure out what it is or what I'm talking about or what people are so upset about, I think we'd have a different conversation. And that the folks who are so fearful of CRT would realize that no, what we really want, and those of us who are racial scholars who use this as a critical perspective, we believe in the potential of growth and unity and harmony. And if you want that too, which is what you are saying by don't teach my kid XYZ or don't make me feel guilty about this. So, what your words are saying is that you want the same thing. What your actions and behaviors are saying is totally different. So,
Right.
how do we come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think in terms of the curriculum, I'm going to just do a little deep dive here.
Hmm.
When we think of this social work curriculum, we're thinking of practice courses, we're thinking of policy courses and
Hmm.
theory courses. Now, we're I get where CRT fits with theory, right? But what does that look like for a practice course or a policy course? Like,
I think that is a great question. And so, I mean, let's start with the policy first, right? Because CRT was birthed out of the legal scholarship. So it fits very nicely in there
hmm
to
hmm
say, when we look at this neighborhood in Harlem, right? I just picked a random city. It could be any city, anywhere, quite honestly, Brooklyn, whatever. When we look at this area in Harlem that before, you know, white people would not venture into, they wouldn't go into. Maybe they might have had, a store, a pizzeria, some kind of business in there, but they weren't living there, right? And then through time, through business changes, all of a sudden this property starts to look valuable to some folks. And then the question becomes, well, do we move in to try to turn it around? What do we do, right? So when we are thinking and we're teaching about gentrification in social work and the understanding of what gentrification is, how gentrification happens, what makes the property valuable, not valuable, and then valuable again. I think CRT allows us the opportunity through its tenants to say, okay, what is it? Where is that interest convergence at, right? That's one of the tenets of CRT. What now makes this palpable or even lucrative to this group of people when it wasn't to the folks who are already there?
Hmm.
And now, one of the biggest things about gentrification is you're pricing out the people who were there, who built the neighborhood. Um, and CRT and also enables us to say, well, when we are taking a look at the neighborhood, when we're taking a look at the property, what are the pieces of that that will continue to thrive? What do we want to take for ourselves and why? So for me, I feel like CRT, when it comes to the policy, a lot of times I remember growing up and thinking, um, why is it that everybody who is black lives over here and all the white folks live over there, and then we come together for school and go back, right? What is the importance of that? Um,
I
CRT helps gives us some of that why to it.
Right. And even within the school where we share, resources seems to be allocated differently, right? So that you might have the advanced courses be 90% white and the regular courses be 90% students of color. And
Hmm.
so it is seen as just the exceptional students of color get placed in these advanced level courses, right?
Right.
So even so you can see how it even happens in shared spaces.
Right. And I think that the other piece, and we've talked about this all along, and I think that unless you know CRT, you wouldn't necessarily pick up on it, right? But we've been talking about challenging the dominant ideology. That is yet another tenet of CRT, is giving that counter narrative for um, cultural narratives of privilege, the idea of color blindness, right? Like, I don't see color. Well, only white people have the privilege and of saying I don't see color because the rest of us live with the impact of race. And I'm going to say the rest of us live with it explicitly because my argument is that white people live with the impact of racism as well, but it's covert and not overt. So CRT allows us to give counter narratives and to challenge the history and to challenge the ahistorical pieces of information that we get. So we've all heard about like failing schools, like failing K-12 schools, and people want to come in and take over the school and all that. And it's just, well, those folks don't want to do well. That's not true. And we need to ask, so then why is that happening? What is going on? And the resources that are out there or the lack thereof, as you talked about, so that even in those shared spaces we come and we say there's still difference within the shared space. And so I think CRT allows us to challenge that dominant um, ideology. It allows us, it really challenge us to look at the historical impact. It also tells us that we need to really center the lived experiences of people and their ways of knowing as valuable and knowledgeable. That if you are a person who is in that school system that you described, the feelings and the feelings and the ideas and the thoughts of those exceptional students in those programs may be very different than what the teachers and those who have placed them in those programs think they are. So talk to them, get their information, hear their data about what those advanced programs are like for them to live in there. And you may be surprised at what you find.
Right, absolutely. So, if you were to think in terms of the practice aspect, we just spoke about the policy. How can you elaborate a little bit more so we have an understanding how it shows up in practice?
So I think in social work practice, it then behooves us. I think that shows up two ways, right? So it shows up with us as educators, and then it shows up with us as practitioners as well. So if it's okay, I'm going to break it down
Mm-hmm.
both ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as practitioners, the way that it shows up is that we then turn around and we value the lived experiences of our clients that we are working with, right? So if you have a client who comes into your office, um, you don't just toss out a list of like, okay, here are the resources that are available to you. No, you get to know them. You get to figure out, do they have a family? Do they not have a family? Are there needs within that family? What are the gaps that are needing to be filled? So that's understanding the lived experiences, right? And we in social work, we talk about that as, start with the person where they're at. Kind of deal is how we frame it. Um, so I think that that's one way is really centering that lived experience and knowing that they have more knowledge about their experiences and their lives than we could ever write about. So, CRT can be effectively applied in an anti racist, kind of equity driven um, aspect by really pushing for us giving them the power, which we say we do as social workers. We empower our clients
Self determination.
to make change, to do things differently. So, right, right. Like this is what we're supposed to be doing. And so that's one way that it happens in practice. Now, you take that same example and you pull that into the education sphere, that still allows us to effectively then look at how can we help our education leadership and our organizations become anti-racist and equity driven. So, if I am a social work educator, I'm teaching my students and helping my students analyze their practice settings for so-called colorblind policies and helping them understand that color blindness is yet another form of racism, of actionable racism, right? So I'm helping them to look for those things. I'm helping them also then to problem solve or to come up with interventions. And sometimes that is very, very simple, right? Sometimes those interventions are you in your space, you're in your office or whatever, and everybody on the wall is white, but 90% of your clients are Caribbean immigrants or, Asian immigrants or from some immigrant population. You're like, okay, so why are all the pictures on the wall white and why are all our documents in English? Right? CRT would, would say you need to challenge that and value them as individuals, right? The health and humanity of all people and start to make those changes. Within the academic setting, then as the educator, that allows me to look for education policies and practices that are also colorblind and racist. And then instead of expecting students to really assimilate to these colorblind policies, what I'm asking you to do is to express your cultural knowledge, to utilize your cultural wealth, right? Yoso work on community cultural wealth to understand in the US context again, oftentimes we have this backlash about people who speak more than one language. And so you're in the streets and you hear somebody speak another language, and we've all heard it, we've seen it. Some of us may have even thought it of, oh, you're in America, why don't you speak English? I'm going to turn that on its head and say, wow, how awesome it is that you speak more than one language. Because the reality is that we are the only developed monolithic country in the world. That doesn't make us special people.
No.
It does not make us special. So CRT allows us to challenge those ideas, and that's one way of striving for equity and anti-racism in the practice field, whether your practice is with clients or if you're an educator. I think the other thing that we do if you're looking in that practice field, and I might make some people a bit uncomfortable with this comment, is looking at what we really think of as quote unquote liberal policies, right? So, like desegregation, for example. Um, when we look at, or women's voting, when this last election, when we voted, I took my little one and they gave her a sticker that said, oh, the centennial of women being able to vote, and we walked away and I said, no, the centennial of white
Of right.
women being
Yeah.
able to vote,
Yeah.
because we were initially left out of the feminist movement. So that's another thing that CRT does, is some of those quote unquote feel good policies. And social work historically has been developed and run by white women, well meaning white women who have often left us out. And so some of these white women are now, coming back around and saying, wait a minute, this is problematic. How do we fix this? How do we move this? And you have other white women who are like, well, I'm a social worker. I believe in the tenets. We're all about social justice. So I'm good to go. There's nothing else for you to teach me.
Right. Well, if that was the case, I don't think Kimberly Crenshaw would have developed intersectionality, right?
Right.
Because the
Right.
feminist theory did not
We
include
wouldn't have, right,
women of
didn't include
color.
us, and we wouldn't have Black feminist thought, right? So we
Exactly.
wouldn't have Patricia Hill Collins, we wouldn't
Right.
have bell hooks talking about, you know, talking back. And oh my gosh, Hooks said in one of her works, she talks about how white feminism was about making space for them to be heard, right? And I'm paraphrasing.
Hmm.
Black feminism was about, no, I already know how to use my voice because I've had to use my voice, but you haven't been listening. So I don't need to make space. I've created the space already. I
Right.
have to figure out how to get you to listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that to me was right. So that's that critique of liberalism that CRT offers. It's an explicit goal, to examine the practices and the policies of even those that are seemingly good. Again, if I care about it and I think you have the potential to grow, that's the critique.
Right.
I and don't be afraid of the critique. It means I believe in you. So let's do
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah. Yeah. You couldn't have said it any different. I really appreciate all that you've said. One question well, actually, I have two more questions, but the first one I want to ask you is the average social work educator in the
Mhm.
classroom is a white
Mhm.
woman,
Mhm.
right? And many of them are liberal, many of them are not. And so when we talk about bringing CRT into the curriculum, whether they show up as field instructors, whether they show up as educators in the classroom, how do what's the strategy, or what have you tried that has worked to bring them on board?
So most of the time, I start with, I like questions. So I start with, is what we're doing working, right? So we in social work, since the civil rights movement, 60s, 70s, we tipped into the water of diversity and multiculturalism as an answer to anti-racism, right? And I think that that was a good beginning. So again, acknowledging the historical foundation, absolutely a good beginning there. However, when we're looking at working towards eliminating racism and truly doing race work, we have to move beyond that and look at evaluating both the quality and the effectiveness of the performance of the work we've done. So most people, even those well-meaning liberal white women, will say, well, the diversity and multiculturalism hasn't worked, quote unquote, at eliminating racism. So what next? So what can we do next? So I think it's engaging in informal conversations with faculty and with our internship liaisons. I think in those spaces are places where we build um, relationships to talk about and address the pervasive nature of racism so that when issues surrounding race emerge, then we have the opportunity to model it for students and we have the opportunity to model it for our internship providers, and that this work is not going through your social work program. You went through the prescribed quote unquote diversity course, you can check off the box like you've got it. Society is dynamic, living is dynamic. Race, what we think of and how we think of race now is very different than it was even 200 years ago, right? One of my favorite books is, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's How the Irish Became White.
I've heard of
So,
it. Yes.
yes, when we think of how when we look at race and how we talk about people now, is totally different because you would come in. I'm a huge football fan, huge football fan. So, and this is going somewhere. So Vince Lombardi, all my football people out there know the Lombardi trophy, that's the Super Bowl trophy, all that good stuff. What most people don't know about Vince is that when he first tried to get in the NFL and coach, he was told nobody whose name ends in a vowel will ever coach in the NFL because he was Italian and Italians weren't considered white and they were considered low. The only groups that were lower than them were Eastern Europeans and the Irish. So, how we think about white people now, we would include Italians, Irish, Eastern Europeans. It wasn't always like that. So, again, I go back to trying to live ahistorically. That's problematic. So I think engaging in these conversations and helping students understand that this is a lifelong process of deconstructing and eliminating racist assumptions and beliefs. Also, understanding that racism is tied to institutions and to power, not necessarily individual people. Understanding that there's a difference between racism and prejudiceness, because when you're prejudiced, that is prejudging, that is literally what the word means. There is no aspect of power to that the same way that it is to racism. So I think having these conversations informally, but also bringing it into the classroom, and we need to stop trying to pack everything into one class. So you asked earlier, how do we do this within our pedagogical structures in social work education? This is not a class that you check mark off of. This is something that we have to embody, and really it becomes part of our code of ethics. It becomes a part of our way of life. So you shouldn't be afraid to have your assumptions and beliefs challenged. My father used to tell me, how do you know you believe what you believe if you're never challenged on it, if you never have to defend it? And there are some things that I've had to defend that, I believe that culturally deficit narratives are harmful to all of us. But I had to do a deep dive, understand what those mean, and understand how those narratives also impact white students and white professionals as well as marginalized population. I believe race neutrality is a lie, right? Like, you see people, you see color.
Mm.
And I also believe that, you know, we try to bastardize Dr. King's message of I want my kids to be judged on the content of their character, get the full understanding of the speech, right? Get fullness of what it meant. If we truly, truly wanted integration, what we would have done with Brown v. Board of Education is we would have dismantled the under resourced Black system, dismantled
Segregated
the
system.
over resourced white system, and created something new
Right.
that was equitable. That's not what we did. right? So we brought marginalized populations into a broken system that didn't want them and didn't
Absolutely.
resource the
And
system that was there and that was loving and that was supportive and that gave
mhm,
them the counter narratives and the understanding of their value and their worth and in this society. So we have the opportunity in social work education to lead the charge on that. Pre-service teaching and pre-service teacher programs have been leading the charge. We need to catch up, we need to join forces, and we need to move forward because social workers are everywhere. We're in business, we're, in mental health. There are more social workers who are mental health providers than psychologists and psychiatrists combined. So if I'm a social worker and I don't fully give you the opportunity to be seen, that I don't understand your lived experience, then how do I help you with your mental health? You can't do those things equitably and
right,
effectively
right.
in silos.
Absolutely. I think you have just summarized everything I wanted to ask you. And so I want to thank you for participating and, having this conversation with me. It was rich. My audience would find it stimulating. And I hope you also had some mutual experience as a result of it.
I did. I want to thank you for reaching out to me after that panel discussion. I was pleasantly surprised, and this has been a lot of fun. And so I'm just going to put it out there on the podcast, on the air. So I hope this is not the end of our relationship, but rather the
Absolutely.
beginning,
Absolutely.
because I am so taken and enamored by you and all that you're doing. And I'm
Oh,
just excited to see you fly and to see you grow.
thank you. Same with you. And this is definitely the beginning and not the end.
Awesome.
And yes, we are both going to be flying.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so
Thank
very much.
you.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.